Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time. We know how busy you are changing the world, and we appreciate you taking an hour and a half here to spend some time with us learning about the North Carolina Utilities Commission. My name is Nancy LaPlaca. I'm a regulatory policy analyst, and I've been doing this work about 15 years all across the country, and spent the many decades before that working in public policy for Congress and other institutions. I want to thank my sponsors, Clean Air NC and the Sierra Club, and also friends and colleagues who helped to make this presentation better. All of the PowerPoints and recording of the webinar will be made available. Please use the chat box to ask questions, and we're going to stop about every 15 minutes to address your questions. So please ask them, and remember that there are no dumb questions, especially in something as complex and really kind of black box as public utilities commissions are. Questions are more than welcome. So Kelly, slide 2, please. So this session 2, we're looking at the North Carolina Utilities Commission and regulation in general. Slide 3, please. And here's our agenda. So we're going to be looking at PUCs, and then we're going to look specifically in detail at the North Carolina Utilities Commission and why it's so important and how the Utilities Commission affects our clean energy future. And also, who influences the decisions? Who's there? Who are the major players within the commission and outside of the commission and the utilities? And how do they affect those decisions? And then what are the major dockets? It's like a court case. You've probably heard these words if you've been involved in this work, such as renewable energy standard or integrated resource plan or rate case. I'm going to explain those in plain language. And again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to write them in the chat box. I'm going to address the risk of natural gas that really is coming to the forefront right now, because the cost of natural gas has skyrocketed. In just the last 6 months, it's doubled. So we're going to take a look at that and how North Carolina's getting 40% of its electricity from fossil gas is a risk, both for the climate and for our pocketbooks. And then I'm going to look a little bit at electricity in the US and North Carolina, and just a brief overview of other states. And then the bottom line of this is that there are lots of opportunities to get involved in affecting energy policy through the North Carolina Utilities Commission. We really saw that this year with the Integrated Resource Plan comments. Kathy Buckley from Apple really made an effort to get people to sign up. About 200 people signed up, and of those 200, 100 made comments. And some of those comments were pretty amazing. And it was kind of a wake-up call, I'd say, for the commission, getting so many comments and getting so many comments that were heartfelt, full of good information, and show that people care about our future and about this agency, the North Carolina Utilities Commission, and what their decisions are. So next slide, please, Kelly, slide 4. So what about PUCs? Does everyone's state have one? And what do? Well, pretty much every state has a PUC. They have varying amounts of authority. Some public utilities commissions have enormous authority, and some have much less authority. These PUCs also have different names, which can be confusing. The Corporation Commission, the Public Service Commission. In Virginia, the SCC, it's called, the State Corporation Commission. And one of the reasons is because when these institutions, these state agencies were created, it was a way different era. And so the focus wasn't necessarily utilities. In fact, here in North Carolina, it was even ferry boats, Ferry, to get across rivers. So most commissions are appointed by the governor, just like ours is in North Carolina, appointed by Governor Roy Cooper right now. But about 25% of the states, or approximately 11 states, are elected. And a few states have kind of weird elections, like South Carolina has kind of an odd system, and so does Virginia. But aside from that, most commissions, they're appointed by the governor, and then people that are appointed are approved by the state legislature. And that is indeed, again, what happens here in North Carolina. Terms are usually 4 to 6 years. Here in North Carolina, we go for longer terms. They're 6 years. Many states are 4. And what do PUCs do? Well, there's a lot of buzzwords in Public Utilities Commission dockets and dealings. And one of those buzzwords is just and reasonable rates. And what is just and what is reasonable? And what do we count in those rates and what do we not count in those rates? So the Public Utilities Commissions are charged with overseeing rate increases and overseeing these various types of proceedings, such as integrated resource planning, rate increases, and renewable portfolio standards. And there's another buzzword I want to mention, and that's reliability. And unfortunately, I would say reliability has often been used in the last decade, and particularly in the last 5 years, as a justification to continue burning fossil fuels. Because fossil fuel plants, because they run on fuel, they can run, of course, 24/7. Whereas renewables are variable. You know, solar produces electricity when the sun shines, wind when the wind blows. Batteries are helping us with that. But really what we're finding, and what the experts who do this work at our national labs that are run by the US Department of Energy, is that these variability problems are solvable, and that we don't have to rely just on fossil fuels in order to have electricity all the time. So PUCs usually regulate all investor-owned utilities, not municipal electric utilities, and not co-ops. And again, co-ops, rural electric co-ops, are exempt because they're overseen by the feds, which is a little unusual, but the reason is because they were created by federal law in the 1930s, right in the middle of the Great Depression, in order to get electricity to rural areas. Okay, next slide, please, slide 5. So what is the NCUC? It's a state level agency. It was created by the General Assembly a long time ago, 130 years ago, in 1891. And at that time, they regulated railroads, steamboats, telegraph companies, and ferry boats. So here we are 130 years later, and now they regulate investor-owned utilities, natural gas, and for our purposes, we're going to skip some of the other things like water and some other services. So the NCUC, again, has limited authority over electric membership co-ops, and they pretty much have what's called plenary or very wide and very broad authority over investor-owned utilities like Duke Energy. And as a member of the NC Clean Air staff asked me to emphasize, and he's completely right, is the NCUC has a lot of authority, and they really have the authority to ask the utilities or order the utilities to do many different things, whether that's community solar, or whether that's energy efficiency programs, or whether that's stopping disconnection of people who can't pay their bills due to the pandemic. They have huge authority. So let's dive in the next slide, slide 6, on our 7 members. So the NCUC is relatively unusual in that it has 7 members. Most PUCs have 3 members. A few have 5. So these 7 members are really, we can be proud of our NCUC. We have some incredibly experienced, dedicated, smart people who really have a handle on these incredibly complex policies. Charlotte Mitchell, who's the chair, is unusual in that she's a young woman in, frankly, a world of mostly older white men. And so to have a chair that's a young person really is quite remarkable, and something, again, that we can be proud of. Almost all of our members have been appointed by Governor Cooper, and pretty soon he will have appointed all of them, because he will have been in office long enough that he will have the opportunity to appoint all 7 members, because they have 6-year terms. So I want to mention something too about the commission. Next slide, please. That's slide 7. Is that the Public Utilities Commissions are unusual agencies in that they're not just the executive branch. So if you look at most state agencies, they're just members of the executive branch. However, the NCUC is what's called quasi-judicial. It's a quasi-judicial agency. The members of the commission act not only in an executive branch, in an executive function, but also in a judicial function. They make decisions, and they make very important decisions that are going to affect all of us in North Carolina, and really the United States and the world for a very long time. When the Utilities Commission makes a decision to approve a power plant permit, that power plant is supposed to run for at least 30 years. Maybe 40. Some of our nuclear plants are scheduled to run 80 years. So these decisions that they make affect all of us for a very long time. The utilities commissions often act in a legislative role also when they take certain kinds of information or hold certain types of hearings. So it's an interesting branch from a constitutional legal point of view. Something I want to mention too is that because of their expertise, decisions that they make are not very often overturned by the courts. And that's because it takes a very, very high level of egregiousness of bad decisions for a court to step in. And that's why you so seldom, whether it's in North Carolina or anywhere across the country, see a court stepping in to overturn a decision by a utilities commission. So next slide, slide 8. I put the NCUC logo on there with the NCGA, the General Assembly, because they also play a big role in North Carolina. And one of the wonderful things that North Carolina does that I don't see in a lot of states is the NCGA requires the NCUC to issue a lot of different types of reports. And in those reports, you can go find out just about anything you want if you're willing to spend the time looking. So every year they give us a report that says, hey, here's what happened in the major cases. So if you want to know, hey, what did happen in that rate case? What was the final amount? How did it break down? You can go to those reports. Or if you want to understand what happened with the renewable energy portfolio standard this year, were any decisions made that affected that? You can go to the REPS report that the NCUC submits to the General Assembly. And there are other reports that are really very, very helpful. And it's great that they require those. So in addition to that, the NCUC answers to the state legislature. So the state legislature, the NCGA, can say, hey, NCUC, can you guys please come in here and answer these questions? We have some questions for you about how you operate, or what do you think about joining RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative? So the NCGA has a lot of power to ask the NCUC, what are you doing? Again, the NCUC has to do a few things. They have to act in the public's interest. They have to provide us with just and reasonable rates, and they have to plan for the future. So next slide, please. Who is the NCUC? Well, they are the deciders. I always love that quote from George Bush Jr. They're the deciders. They're the guys, they're the people, the men and women who make the decisions that are critical to our clean energy transition. They have the ability, the power to, whether it's ask for more transparency and more hearings, or ask Duke Energy to provide more low-income programs, or to not disconnect people who can pay their bills. They have enormous authority. I also want to mention that there's many people on this call, I hope, and probably they did, made public comment during the IRP. And I want to point out the difference between public comment and an evidentiary hearing, because that's critical. When you make a public comment, it's just a comment. It doesn't necessarily affect the outcome. But when you have an evidentiary hearing, which is under oath, where nobody can lie, and where parties in the docket are required by law to address issues that are brought up by other parties, that is a key difference. And in fact, that is why various groups have been calling for evidentiary hearings, because it's one thing for a solar expert to make a public comment and say, hey, solar's cheap. It's another thing when that person is a party in a docket and they bring it up at an evidentiary hearing and they say, look, NCUC and Duke Energy, this is what our costs are. So Duke Energy, please respond to that. Or climate change. We're concerned about climate change as a party. Let's just say you've got an environmental group as a party. They want the NCUC to force Duke to respond. And that is why evidentiary hearings are so critical. I'm going to mention something that happened to me when I moved to North Carolina in 2014 and went to a hearing. I ran into one of the high-level staffers that I had known from just years of being in this business. And I said to him, well, why don't you guys have hearings online? In other words, if I wanted to know what was going on at a hearing, I had to drive to Raleigh, go to the NCUC, go to the basement, and sit there. Now, all over the country, you can attend hearings online. And what he said to me was, oh, no one cares. That could not be further from the truth. Lots of people care. Billions and billions of dollars are being spent. Many, many people care. And as we understand how critical clean energy is to addressing climate change and jobs and economic transition, more and more people are going to show up. So one of the good things about the pandemic, as far as I'm concerned, is that it has forced public utilities commissions all over the country to recognize that this is an era where I don't have to get in my car, I live in Boone, and drive 4 hours to Raleigh to make a public comment for 3 minutes. I should be able to just get online. Okay, so let's see. Let's get to the next slide here. And before I start this, I want to ask, are there any questions?
Yes, Nancy, we have a few.
Okay, what do we got?
Okay, great. So this is from Karen and Joe Bearden. Can you discuss regulatory capture regarding the Utilities Commission, the impact of retired utility folks being appointed to utilities commissions?
Karen, that is a great question. And hello, Karen and Joe. Whenever I hear the birds, I think about you guys. So that was what I was getting into in this next slide, Karen, about just the revolving door and this whole idea of regulatory capture that I think we all heard a lot about with the banking crisis. But of course, it's in other industries. And it's particularly pernicious, I would say, in the utilities arena because of the level of expertise, because of the access, because of the way the utilities are so embedded in our utilities commissions all across the country. So I will get to that. What's the next question, June?
Okay. This is from Maple O. Nancy may answer this in her talk now. Mine is that we hear it said that the NCUC only recommends and has no power to rule But recently the NCGA tried to subtract some of that NCUC power. Then NCUC must have real authority. Why the mixed messages? And if they do recommend great things, then what?
Okay, that's a good question too, because it gets complicated. So basically what you're talking about, Maple, that you've seen and you've experienced now is jurisdictional authority. Who has the authority? So let's take an example from Duke Energy a few years ago, where they went to the NCGA and they wanted to pass a law that said we can get certain types of cost recovery in law, and we don't have to go ask the NCUC to get that type of cost recovery. So the NCGA can override the NCUC. So let me give you another example. This one's from Asheville. And folks might remember when Duke Energy went to the NCGA and they passed a law, I think it was around 2015, might have been 2016, where they said, hey, we hereby require, this is a law, that the NCUC is going to get a permit for a natural gas power plant in Asheville, the 500 megawatt natural gas combined cycle power plant that's now running. And guess what? We don't think it should go through the regular hearing. We don't want it to take a year like a normal power plant permit does. We want this fast tracked. And so that's what they did. They basically passed a law, and the law said, hey, when Duke Energy files this application for a permit for a natural gas plant in Asheville, there's going to be no hearing and no debate and no witnesses and no nothing. And the NCUC must approve it within a certain amount of days. And so really, you've got this interesting interplay between who's got the jurisdiction. And the NCGA can usually trump the NCUC, except if you have a Public Utilities Commission that has its authority in the Constitution, which North Carolina does not. So I hope that answers your question, Maple. Any other questions, June?
Let me just check one. Okay, she just said that seems horrible. Yes.
All right.
That's it for now, Nancy.
Okay, then I want to go into depth in this because Karen asked about this, and she's right. So this is an article from not very long ago. What was that, July 14th? And here's what happened. So all these when the Utilities Commission says, here's how much electricity is going to cost, or Duke Energy says, here's how much it's going to cost. Well, there's a model. They build a model. And for the past many decades, those models have been black boxes. When I started this work in 2006, it was a total black box. Now it's not such a black box. And there are many, many sophisticated, excellent groups all over the country who know how the black box works, and they can build their own models. So what happened was Duke Energy got on a radio show and they said, hey, the public staff, which is nonpartisan, hey, the public staff agrees with us. They like what we said. They like our model. And really what happened was the Duke Energy created the model and gave it to the public staff. And until the Energy and Policy Institute filed FOIA requests, that's Freedom of Information Act requests, Daniel Tate, really a wonderful, incredible researcher, he got these emails that showed that Duke Energy literally gave to the NCUC staff this model. And then, unfortunately, the public staff sort of pretended that this model was theirs or that it wasn't from Duke Energy. And so what you can see is that there's a revolving door. I have seen this in state after state after state after state. And honestly, I feel like I've seen it to the point where in some states, it borders on criminal. And in fact, in Montana, it went all the way to a court. It did go to a court because commissioners fraudulently used information that basically went against the record. And because the interveners could find evidence that the Montana Public Service Commission willingly and knowingly killed solar, it went to a court. It went all the way up to the Montana Supreme Court. So this is a problem that's not just here, it's everywhere. I mean, look at former NCUC Chair Ed Finley. He was a utility attorney for decades. And I can tell you, as someone who's been doing this work intensely for 15 years, every state that you learn about, it's like getting a PhD. So when you have people who really know the ins and outs, you're at a complete disadvantage. And industry has direct access that basically we don't have. In fact, one of the most interesting things I think about House Bill 951 is that the manufacturers joined with the environmentalists, and the manufacturers agreed that the modeling provided to the public staff by Duke Energy lowballed the rate increases to be expected. Now, you don't see that too often, the manufacturers joining together with the environmentalists, although it is happening more. Walmart is in many dockets across the country, not just North Carolina. So let's go to the next slide here, slide 11. And I just wanted to show you an excerpt from this article that's, again, there's the link. And that the nonpartisan public staff's analysis, basically Duke did not tell WRAL that it was Duke's analysis and not the public staff. So next, please, slide 12 here. Who influences decisions? Well, excuse me, but who do you think influences all the decisions? I mean, it's the incumbent utilities. Now, to a large extent, that's understandable. They should, but they shouldn't to the point where they shut other people out, and where we have this black box and this, black hole where we've got a bill like House Bill 951 that's going to affect 10 million people in the state of North Carolina, and yet it's all done in secret behind closed doors. That is not democracy. I also want to point out that if you look at that map there, that's North Carolina's electric power providers. You see the green and the light green. That's electric co-ops. The dots are cities. The stripes is where Duke Energy is. But where Duke Energy is also where all the people are. So even though the rural electric co-ops have more geographic territory, right, in terms of just the total acreage, the total land mass, it's the rural electric co-ops. Duke Energy by far has more customers. In addition, Electricities, which represents cities across North Carolina, and also co-ops are involved. They purchase electricity from Duke Energy and simply resell it. So when people tell you that Duke Energy literally sells 90 to 95% of the electricity in North Carolina, that's why, because they resell it. In fact, something interesting about Electricities is all of these cities, they are tied to Duke Energy's nuclear power plants until the 2040s, 2050s, and 2060s. That's a long time. That is a long time to be tied into a contract that you basically cannot get out of. Okay, so I want to mention also antitrust. So what's antitrust? Let's think about back in the 80s when probably most of you were not alive, but I was young. And basically, antitrust was really affecting media at that time. So if one entity owned all the media outlets, all the radio stations, all the TV stations, all the newspapers, you would say, gee, that's not a good idea, because they can just basically dictate everything. And so we had rules in this country until it was gutted in 2005 by the Energy Policy Act, George Bush Jr. and Dick Cheney. And basically what they did was they gutted the rules that said that utilities could not own the entire what's called the vertically integrated supply chain. So what happens when your electricity company buys up all the competition? Well, that's what they did. Duke Energy bought Progress. Duke Energy bought Piedmont Gas. Duke Energy wanted to build the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, and then they wanted to make money from that pipeline, selling it to their own power plants. So I certainly hope that we get back to a place in this country where we put these antitrust laws back in place, because without it, we're just killing competition. There is no competition. When you have one entity that owns everything end to end, you know, what kind of competition is there? Okay, so let's see, whoops here. So next slide, please, and that's slide 13. So what are the new influences? Well, it's all of us, frankly. It's everybody on that screen, and some I forgot to put on, like SELC. You know, there are new people showing up. There are frontline communities. There are people saying no more. I want to tell a little story here too. When I started this work in 2006, I went to a community in Denver where I was working at the time. And I said, hey, me and my friend, we're gonna try to get this coal plant closed. And the folks who lived in that neighborhood said, you know, lady, thanks a lot, lady, white lady, middle-aged white ladies showing up. But you know, what we really want you to shut down is that refinery that keeps exploding once in a while called Suncor. In fact, they're actually finally making some headway on that now. We want you to help us with that rendering factory that is just stinking up the whole neighborhood. So really what I saw, and it wasn't a shock really, but it was very obvious, was that the coal plant wasn't these people's only problem. Basically, we have a huge environmental justice problem where we're sticking all this dirty stuff into neighborhoods that where poor people live, where less wealthy people live, where people of color live. And we're going to get into that more in depth in our EJ sections, which are going to be the next two sessions. So you still have the 500-pound gorillas like the investor-owned utilities, but increasingly our energy advocates are increasingly sophisticated. And, you know, the advocates that we have in this state, we should all be proud because they are good and they are smart and they are on it. And when I look at the work that these people are doing, I am just blown away at the quality of the work that is really pretty unbelievable. I also want to mention that mom and pop residential solar firms have always had less influence, not just here, but everywhere. But we have a couple of folks who've been in this game a long time, who are now at Sunrun, and they are really doing some great work and helping promote rooftop solar in this state, because we have hardly any rooftops in this state. You know, there's 2.5 million rooftops in this country right now. I believe it's 2.5 million. And in this state, even though we have the second most solar, we only have maybe 20,000 roofs, not very many. So that has to change. I also want to thank Kathy Buckley for inspiring a lot of comments on the IRP. It was pretty amazing, the turnout. So let's turn next slide here to slide 14. What does the NCUC do? And I'm going to be sitting here for a little bit to explain these. So hello, Duke Energy. There's a picture of the NCU. What are your plans? That's integrated resource planning in a nutshell. What are your plans? What are your plans for the next 15 years? Some states just ask, what are your plans for the next 5 years or 10 years? But in our state, we ask the next 15 years. So what are you going to do? One of the reasons why I know it disturbs me that we don't have evidentiary hearings is that if we don't have an evidentiary hearing on our integrated resource plan, we just take as gospel everything that Duke Energy says. There is no opportunity for the solar industry, for low-income advocates, for people like grid alternatives, or folks who do energy efficiency or audits. There's no opportunity for them to come in and say, hey, NCUC and citizens of North Carolina and Duke Energy, we can do it cheaper and we can do it cleaner. So that really is the purpose of having transparency and process. So one of the most important things that they do is the second one, power plant permits. And this is how I started, actually. I challenged a power plant permit for a clean coal plant in Colorado in 2006. And I tell people that, you know, my baloney detector became very, very sensitive after fighting clean coal, because you wouldn't believe how many billions of dollars have been poured down the drain by clean coal, and a lot of it by Duke Energy. They have a clean coal plant that never worked in Indiana that cost ratepayers 10 times more than if they would have just bought power on the open market. So there's something else I want to mention with power plants that's especially relevant to North Carolina. And that is that Duke Energy has taken these old coal plants. Some of them are literally 50 years old, 60 years old. They pull the guts out and they put in new guts for a natural gas plant. But the problem is that converted natural gas plant is very inefficient compared to a new natural gas plant. And so basically you have a situation where you have a natural gas plant that is really, really polluting and inefficient. And so there's no permit process because they can just swap out the coal plant permit for a gas permit. So there's no hearing. There's no opportunity to be heard. There's no opportunity to ask Duke Energy, hey, why are you guys converting this 50-year-old coal plant to something that is far less efficient? Why are you doing this? Why don't you just build a brand new gas plant that's far more efficient and polluting? And I would say that at least some of the reason is because they didn't have to have a hearing. And we have quite a few of those types of power plants, those coal conversions in this state. And quite honestly, it's really easy to see that those are the first that are going to be economically unviable. They are not going to be as economically viable as a brand new natural gas plant, like the one built by NTE Energy at Kings Mountain. That one is far more efficient. Okay, so let's move on here to the REPS, the Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Portfolio Standard. Now, I believe that North Carolina is the only state that has a standard where you combine EE and RE, energy efficiency and renewable energy. Let me tell you why this is so profoundly not smart, and no one else does it. Because when you save energy, that is way different than adding energy to the grid and renewable energy efficiency standard. The rules are completely different. The way that you measure success is completely different. Everything is completely different. And so when you have a standard where you combine these two, all it does is make for confusion, frankly. And what ends up getting short shrift is the energy efficiency part, because you practically have to have a PhD to understand the details. I mean, it's ridiculously complicated, and it doesn't work. And it doesn't serve anyone, really. It doesn't serve the people. It doesn't serve the commission. It doesn't serve our community at all. The last one I want to mention here is rate design. And rate design is complicated. And it's complicated because there's so many different pieces in it. And I would like to boil this down, actually, on rate design to really, what is it? It's just a fancy way to say who's paying. So let's look at the next slide here, slide 15. And rate design is all about fairness. And let me give an example here of going out to dinner. Let's just say that you and 3 other friends go out to dinner, and you guys, all basically eat and drink about the same, so you get the bill and you say, okay, the bill is $100. Let's each pay $25. But in an unfair rate design, one person would have to pay $50, one person would pay $0, and maybe the other 2 would pay $25. And you would say, wow, that's unfair. Well, rate design is kind of the same way. And here's a simple chart I made to try to explain this. So let's look at our customer types: residential, small commercial, large commercial, and industrial. Those are basically the 4 types of customers that we have. And honestly, this is typical. This is true, this breakdown in many, many states, not just here. So let's look at the residential users. Well, they use 50% of the electricity that's generated in this state, let's just say, but they make up 80% of the money that gets paid into the renewable energy portfolio standard. Now, is that fair? Not really. Let's compare them to the extra large industrials. And again, this is typical. This happens in many, many states. So the large industrials use maybe 20% of the electricity, but they only pay 5% of the total amount in the renewable energy standard. So it's all about fairness. I learned this the hard way, and let me tell you a story about that. I was in Arizona. It was around 2010 or so, and I was kind of new to this and just trying to figure it all out. What's going on here? And so I told my boss, look, the renewable energy standard here, I think the mines are hardly paying anything, but I can't figure it out. So you have to ask them from the bench what's going on. So basically, the Arizona, because it produces 60% of the country's copper and a huge amount of silver, the mines use a huge amount of electricity. And for some utilities, it's 20%. That's a lot. So basically, I had my boss ask the question like 3 times. What is the mine paying into the renewable energy standard? And the answer was something like $17 a month. And every face in that room turned to the mining guys and said, $17? Because if they were paying what they should have paid relative to the residential ratepayers, they literally would have paid $10 million a year. 10 million. Instead, they were paying a few hundred. So this happens a lot. And unfortunately, because we have so few eyes looking at these rate cases, that's why these things happen. So next slide here, slide 16. Cost of service regulation. And this is the last thing I'll talk about when it comes to rate design. So what's cost of service? It's basically what the words say. What does it cost to serve the people? And then plus we want a 10% rate of return. So here's an example. A utility builds a substation for $100 million. And these substations, you've probably seen them and driven around. They're just part of the landscape now. But it's basically these giant, they look like giant springs. And it's where the voltage gets stepped up and stepped down. So the utility builds a $100 million substation, and they want to get that $100 million back, but they also want profit. So they get 10% on spending that money. Now, I'm not going to get into how they get more profit on certain types of debt than others, but basically they get a 10% rate of return. So, of course, their impetus is to spend more and more and more money. This is why utilities love nuclear. It's very expensive. And when you can just add 10% rate of return onto something that's very expensive, you make a lot more money quickly. So the bottom line is that the more money utilities spend on assets, power plants, transmission lines, substations, stuff you build, the more profit they make. And again, as I talked about in the last presentation, this is my favorite all-time headline from Dave Roberts, who then was with Grist. He's a writer on utility issues. Solar power could destroy U.S. utilities, say U.S. utilities. So again, this is why utilities are fighting solar and rooftop solar. I also want to mention that rate cases aren't cheap for anyone. And where it's hard to find this data, I have a link here in the speaker notes that you can see. I found on FERC Form 1, which is a form that utilities file with FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And basically what it said on page 450.1 is that Duke Energy Carolinas, so we're not talking about Duke Energy Progress, we're just talking about half of Duke Energy in the state of North Carolina. Duke Energy Carolinas, in 1 year, they spent $11.5 million on rate cases. $11.5 million. That's probably more than the budget of every single environmental group in the state of North Carolina total. It's got to be. So you just see what you're up against, really. Okay, so next slide here, slide 17. This is something that gets under the radar, and I want to make sure people see this, is that Duke Energy they didn't pay any taxes in 2020. Instead, you can see on the last line of this screen grab, they got a refund of $281 million. So here you have one of the largest corporations in the country and the world, one of the most powerful utilities in the country and the world. And basically, they got back $281 million from the federal government. So whatever amount of money that you paid in taxes, you paid a lot more than Duke Energy because they got $281 million back. So June, this is a good breaking point. I'm just going to pull up the next slide, slide 18. Are there questions?
Nancy, we don't have any questions. Joe mentioned Leah Stokes' book, and I'll send this around, Short Circuiting Policy.
A great book. I used it for my class when I taught last. It's really good. I mean, if you really want to understand some of this stuff, she gives you some examples, like what happened in Texas, what happened in Arizona. I think she does what happened in Ohio. She does 4 states. And it's a great book, Joe. Thanks for mentioning that. And if you want to follow somebody good on Twitter, if folks are on Twitter, there's a thing called Energy Twitter, hashtag Energy Twitter. Sign up for it. And there's a guy who runs a spreadsheet, and you can just put yourself in the spreadsheet if you look up Energy Twitter, and follow Leah Stokes. She's a brilliant young professor from Santa Barbara, and she really is quite incredible, and can't recommend her enough. So thanks, Joe. Okay, slide 19. Let's get into House Bill 951, which, as probably almost everyone on this call knows, just happened. Now, of course, it was super secret. It was behind closed doors. I mean, this is not the way to run democracy. We all know that. If we want policy that's good, it must be in the open, right? Who was it that said, you have to have, if you don't have democracy, if you don't have openness, democracy dies in darkness. I think it's Justice Brandeis that said, sunshine is the best disinfectant. Well, absolutely. There's no question about that. So let's get back here to House Bill 951. So there was an attempt by Duke to take decision-making authority out of the NCUC and put it in the NCGA, and that didn't happen, which is good, because our experts at the NCUC, they are smart and they are good. And so let's let them figure it out. It fulfills Governor Cooper's goals to reduce CO2, 70% from 2005 levels by 2030, but it's not mandated. And so for those people who work in the trenches, who know the difference between a goal and something that's mandated, it's the difference between maybe and must. And I would like to say, I think we're getting to a point, obviously, with climate change where we're going to start mandating things because the utilities just tend to drag their feet. And so when it's a goal, but it's not mandated, it's just harder to get there. Something that Joel mentioned too is penalties, and he's right. And I've seen way too many states where they have certain types of standards, an energy efficiency standard, a renewable portfolio standard, but there's no penalties. So if there's no penalties, then the utility has no downside. We need penalties. If we want these things to happen, penalties are unfortunately necessary. I want to mention carbon neutrality by 2050 and just say that, honestly, I think that's kind of sad. I mean, we're looking at a situation where by 2050, we could be hitting 3 degrees centigrade warming, which is civilization ending. This is many, many scientists. So to have a goal of carbon neutrality by 2050 is just way too late. Let's wake up. That is ridiculously far in the future, and we need to do it much, much sooner. Performance-based incentives. This is something that's been going on that utilities have been talking about for 20 years. Let's do it. Performance-based incentives just basically say, they say, we'll give you more whatever you want, utility, which is money. We'll give you more money if you hit this goal. Now, performance-based incentives in the bill are voluntary and depend on Duke Energy. In states where they're not voluntary, if they don't hit it, there's a penalty. And if you want an example of a state that's doing some good things with performance-based incentives, Colorado is kind of leading the pack right now. I'm going to mention RGGI also. That's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. It's 11 states in the Northeast, and they put a price on carbon. And it's been around for about 20 years. It's not perfect, but it's a start. And let me tell you the good about it and the bad about it. The good about it is that it puts a price on carbon so that utilities get the signal, hey, we don't want carbon. But here's the bad part about it. You get to pay to pollute. How fair is it to our neighbors and our communities and our frontline communities if we say, okay, yeah, we'll just let that power plant keep dumping pollution on you and we'll just charge them a little bit more money. But of course the utility can afford it because they've got lots of money. And so there are some problems with this. I mean, I do not mean to discount those problems. There are problems. So let's go to the next slide here, slide 20. And I want to mention this because $50 million for a modular nuclear reactor is gone. But what's really under the radar that not a lot of people know about is that Duke Energy already lost $558 million, actually. I put 500 in there, it's 558 for an abandoned reactor. So they're already getting cost recovery after spending $558 million on a reactor that they're not going to build for North Carolina. Now, remember, the abandoned nuclear plant in South Carolina cost $9 billion. You know, but 558 million, that ain't chump change. And that's what we're paying. We are paying for Duke Energy's mistake right now. We're paying for it, all of us. And my utility is a reseller. So my utility buys energy from Blue Ridge Electric, which buys it from Duke. So it still comes from Duke. I also want to mention in House Bill 951 that there are some parties who think that it's going to be a 50% rate hike over 10 years, but nobody knows, of course. A continued reliance on natural gas not only accelerates climate change, but we don't know what natural gas is going to cost. We have no idea. In the last 6 months, the price doubled. So natural gas power plants are unusual in that 70% of the cost is the fuel. Let me repeat that. 70% of the cost of running a natural gas power plant is the fuel. So what really affects the cost of running the power plant? The fuel cost. Now, the utilities, that's just a pass-through. They don't make a profit on that. It just gets passed through to customers. But nonetheless, the customers pay the fuel bill. So, again, no enforcement provisions, no financial penalties. And as Joel pointed out, we need guardrails. And guardrails is just a way to say, hey, if something gets out of control, if the cost of natural gas goes through the roof, then we do this. If the cost of solar goes through the roof, then we do this. If we find that, you know, this certain pollution is killing people, then we do that. We need guardrails, and guardrails are going to help us from going too far in any different direction. And these are a very common thing in rate design. So next, slide 21 is what's a multi-year rate increase? A multi-year rate increase is a way for utilities to not have hearings. Basically, it says in the law that the NCGA passed, they said, hey, Duke Energy, you don't have to worry about filing a rate increase. We're just going to give it to you automatically. So basically, they're going to get an automatic rate increase. It's locked in. And no hearings, again, no opportunity to be heard, no transparency. We're just going to get the rate increase. And some of those rate increases are going to be up to 4% per year. Again, when the manufacturers got together with the environmentalists, they determined that the cost increase could be $122 a year for customers in year 3. $122 a year. And they tell us that solar is expensive. I mean, we're getting to a point, honestly, where it's kind of ridiculous, you know, and that by not having hearings, by not having a transparent process, we're just locking in bad decisions, really. We've got almost 500,000 customers of DEC and DEP that are behind on bills, and that really wasn't taken into account. And also least cost. And I want to kind of mention this because it's something that I've been looking at for a long, long time. Least cost for who? And I will never forget at the first hearing I went to where I was scared and my voice was shaking. And when the guy from the coal industry said coal is cheap, I stood up and said, cheap for whom? Who's it cheap for? Because when that one coal kilowatt hour that costs 3 cents, or maybe now it costs 4 or 5 cents, maybe even 6 cents. The damages that it done are not 10 cents, not 20 cents, but up to 30 cents. So let's think about this and let's consider this, because that's what's hurting us and hurting our communities. When least cost, they only count what they want to count, not what we care about. So I want to get into some utility nerd funnies here, and tell a little, you know, I got this on Twitter actually. And this one, natural gas is clean, right? Slide 22. In 2014, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change told us that natural gas, methane, fossil gas, that is 86 times worse for the climate than CO2. Now, this should have set off alarm bells, but somehow it didn't. And basically, what happened was the utilities and the EPA just continued to use the old numbers. And the IPCC said, look, because methane is highly reactive and it completely breaks down in the atmosphere within 12 years, why are we counting this over 100 years? There's a good reason to count CO2 over 100 years, and that's because after 100 years, 25% of the CO2 is still in the atmosphere, and even some is even left after 1,000 years. So they determined that a 100-year period of time is a good idea. However, methane breaks down in 9 to 12 years. So why are we using 100 years? And because it's so highly reactive, it does 86 times more damage in terms of warming than CO2. Now, this has to change. And I will tell you that if indeed the utility industry and the EPA would have recognized this in 2015, we would not have had tens of thousands of megawatts of natural gas plants built all over this country. That would not have happened. Okay, so let's look at number 2. We failed to plan for that again. Whoops, we need some money to fix it. Can you say coal ash? Coal ash liability in North Carolina is supposed to be $10 billion. I had a particular interest in coal ash myself because way back in 2007, and I did a lot of filing on it in Arizona and Colorado. And basically, you could see what a problem it was. It was pretty obvious. And I remember going to a presentation by the National Association of Regulatory Utilities Commissioners that said the coal ash problem around this country is about $20 billion. It can be solved. $20 billion, that's a lot of money. Well, guess what? Fast forward to the Dan River coal ash spill in February of 2014, and guess what? They estimate that to clean up North Carolina's coal ash ponds is $10 billion. So how can it possibly be that it's only $10 billion to clean up all the other coal ash ponds in this country? And there's about 600. So we need to be real. We need to get real. We need to be realistic about the costs and the benefits of what we're doing and what kind of electricity we're generating. So let's look at the third one. You totally don't need to fine us for breaking the law again. Well, coal ash, of course, is a good one. And then let's go to the next ones. We aren't allowed to consider positive externalities in a rooftop solar policy. Okay, this really happened here in North Carolina. And I remember a docket a few years ago where Duke Energy wanted to give extra benefits to nuclear because it doesn't produce CO2, which is true. Building the power plant, the nuclear plant produces a lot of CO2, but not once the plant's been built. But they didn't want to give that same value to solar. So this is picking and choosing. We need transparency. We need these policies to be applied to all types of power plants across the board. What are the costs and what are the benefits? So let's look at the second one. Check out the positive externalities of our economic development rider for coal mines. Now, I believe in a just transition. I'm sure all of us do. Many people who lost coal mining jobs, they need help. We want to help them. All of us want to help people that are hurting. I know that. But basically, let's not just pick and choose what we want to call a economic development and ignore all of the jobs from solar, which is 79 times more jobs than coal. Again, 79 times more jobs than coal. And yet they want to count it when we talk about other types of fossil generation. Then the third one here, maybe if we call it grid modernization, regulators will prove it. You see all the utilities across the country using this, and that's probably EEI, Edison Electric Institute, the trade group, because they come up with the buzzwords and then everybody just uses the buzzwords. So the next slide, slide 24, I love this one, annual transparency report, and it's all blacked out. And I want to give another example. I asked my utility, New River Light and Power, which is owned by Appalachian State University, which is 1% clean energy, just one, if they would please give me the contract that they signed with NTE, which is a natural gas combined cycle private merchant generator. They build power plants in the East. Can I see that contract, please? Well, it took them months to respond. And when they gave me the contract, it was mostly blacked out. So it really didn't do me any good. So here we have a utility that's owned by the university, which is an educational institution. And basically the whole contract is blacked out. And so that's why we have groups like Energy and Policy Institute who file these FOIAs, because here's the beauty of government. When you're in government, whatever your emails are, whatever your communications are, they're supposed to be public. And thank heaven for that, or we would be really in the dark. So let's see, you won't believe the size of this rate increase. You know, I mean, if you could look at utility rate increases, you see that every couple of years, Duke's probably asking for anywhere between 400 million and 1.2 billion. So these rate cases, they keep coming and coming and coming and coming. Another reason why renewables are a good idea. There's no operation and maintenance costs, very low, and there's no fuel costs. And there's no detrimental effects from the fuel, nuclear waste, coal ash, flue gas desulfurization, bag houses, mercury, etc. And then the last one, the IRP is using 20-year-old renewable energy cost assumptions. This happens all the time. Again, this is why we need a hearing, and this is why we need an evidentiary hearing. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next slide, slide 25. And I just put this in here recently because natural gas costs are going through the roof right now. And I spent many years on natural gas, starting around 2007. And what you see is that natural gas, of course, is a fossil gas. It's mostly fracked in this country, 80 to 90% fracked. And that basically it's going to run out. And so we need to plan ahead. And we need to, as much as possible, get away from depending on fossil fuels, especially when they pollute a lot and add to climate change. And the latest science tells us that natural gas fracking in the United States, it's mostly in the United States, there's not much in the rest of the world, it contributes about 25% of our current warming, and that's a lot. So next slide, please, 26. And please look at the date on this slide. Look, it's October 5th. October 5th, 2020 to October 4th, 2021. So this covers a 1-year period. And look how the cost of gas has doubled in really 6 months. Now, I've seen this before. I've seen it go up to $13 a million BTU. But here's the difference. When in 2008, the cost of natural gas skyrocketed, the fracking boom hit. And right now, if you look at fracking supplies and reserves, and we will get into this in future sessions, the depletion rate for frack gas is incredibly high. Your average fracked well depletes 70 to 90% in 3 years. Let me repeat that. Your average fracked well depletes between 70 and 90% in 3 years. So one of my witnesses called that the Red Queen syndrome from Alice in Wonderland. You have to run faster and faster just to keep up. You have to keep drilling and drilling and drilling and drilling. And again, we have the problem that fossil gas is a super potent greenhouse gas, and we have methane leaks. Somewhere between 2.5% to 5% in production, distribution, and transportation of the gas. Next slide, please. So let's look at the electricity mix, past, present, and future. And then I'll be wrapping up here. So next slide, slide 28. This is really a great view. This illustrates two things for me that are big. One is, look, it starts in 1950, right? Look at that coal exploding up until around 2010. And since then, it's down by almost half. That is remarkable. Here's the other thing. We knew how bad coal was starting in 1990, and yet we added all that coal-fired power. That was just, our children will not forgive us for that. And then you look at natural gas, and natural gas has gone up, 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 right? And look how much it's gone up just since 2010. So we have almost displaced all the coal that was removed with natural gas, which is going to be a problem. I also want to point out, see that it says renewables 21%. And that includes hydro. And here's why that's a problem. Because wind is about 9 or 10 or 11% right now. Solar is about 2.5 to 3.5. Hydro across the country is about 7%. But if you've been paying attention to what's going on in the Western United States, hydropower in California is down like 80 or 90%. In fact, let me tell another story about Duke Energy. They owned a hydro plant in Brazil, the country of Brazil, which is getting hit very, very, very hard with not just COVID, but also climate change. And they sold that hydropower plant to China for $1.2 or $3 billion. Well, guess what? Here in 2021, that hydropower in Brazil is down 90% because of drought. So these people are not, they know what's going on, you know. Okay, next slide, slide 29. This is just a different view. And what you'll find is that none of these are exactly the same because it depends on when did they get the data, exactly what date, etc. But you see the trend. We're basically in this country 40% natural gas, up from just 5%, 20 years ago. Coal is down to, 18, 20, 17 to 20%. Nuclear is at 20% where it's been for a long time. Wind, I've seen the wind industry have numbers of 10%. I don't know why that's 8.4%, but it's in the ballpark, 9, 10%. And then solar here, US wide says 2.3, but when you add distributed solar, when you add rooftop solar, which a couple of people are doing, like John Farrell from ILSR, Institute for Local Self-Reliance, or others, it's really more like 3 or 3.5. So next slide here. And I want people to understand the future. Let's talk about the future. Let's look at this. This is from EIA, which is the US Department of Energy. And the link is, again, is in the speaker notes. So look at where I've circled 2020, 2030, 2040, 2050. So this chart was created in 2020, obviously. There's the line. And they're telling us the projections. Well, look at their projections. Petroleum, they just keep making it. Natural gas, we just keep pumping it. Coal, coal stays the same. Renewable energy goes up slowly. So basically, this has been disputed actually by many energy analysts. If you could see the actual of renewable energy, it's more going up exponentially, and it's going up much, much faster. Okay, next slide here, slide 31. And I'm almost to the end here, folks. Electricity in the Southeast, NC and SC. Here we are at the southeastern US, and look at Mississippi and Louisiana, how heavy natural gas they are. Why? Because all that natural gas comes in right there, and so they have a lot of natural gas power plants. You see, Louisiana is very, very sunny, but they have hardly any solar. Mississippi has a little, Alabama has a little more, and Georgia has a little. So let's move next to North and South Carolina in slide 33. You see that Florida has a huge amount of electricity generation from natural gas, fossil gas. It's interesting to note that their coal comes in from a barge from South America. Now, it wasn't that long ago that Florida was like 50% coal, but they've really ramped coal down in the last, 5-8 years. So have all utilities in all states. North Carolina, we never had coal come in on barges because our continental shelf is too shallow. If you look at North and South Carolina, we're 7% solar right now. South Carolina is less than 2%. But despite the fact that we have a fair amount of solar, we don't have many rooftops. And in future sessions, we're going to talk about clean energy and how it brings so many jobs. Okay, next, slide 34. And I'm not going to go into detail on these, but just look at the colors. Look at the fact that the Southeast is just white. And what that means is very few states in the Southeast have any kind of clean energy standard, any kind of clean energy goal. And I will tell you that, in my opinion, that's just because you've got the utilities that are a huge influence on the politics, and that it's really slowed down clean energy development, and also that they watched clean energy take off in the Western United States in the decade before, and they were able to put rules in place that basically stopped clean energy. So that's what happened, I think. Next slide, slide 35. Again, look at that white spot there in the Southeast. Now, there's many other states that don't have energy efficiency standards, but we need some too. Okay, slide 36. How much clean energy do other states have? And I'm going to go through these and end right on time. This slide, look at the date on it. It's 2019. And forget trying to see those small numbers. Just look at the dark colors. The darker the color, the more electricity that state gets from wind electricity. So look at Iowa. Right there it says, I think it says 41.9. That was in 2019. 2 years later, that number is 68%. Okay. In 2 years, Iowa went from basically 42% of its electricity coming from wind to 68%. That is how fast we could make change if we chose to. Now, you look at Texas, it's dark, but not as dark as the other states. And that's because even though it has the most wind capacity by far, in other words, the number of turbines, because Texas is such a huge state with like 40 million people or so, it takes a lot longer to get to a percentage of electricity from wind, right? So even though Texas has far more wind turbines than Iowa is a small state with not many people. So if Iowa has, 100 wind turbines, that's a lot more than Texas having 100 wind turbines. Okay, let's look at the next slide, which is slide 38. And again, just look at the colors here, folks, and those dots. See all those dots? That's where wind projects are. The middle of the country is very, very, very windy. We're going to get into this in later sessions because unfortunately, but right there on the edge is where the eastern and the western interconnect meet. So in other words, all that great wind from Colorado can't get sent to Chicago because of the way the grid is. Nonetheless, there is a huge amount of wind in the Midwest, as you can see. And there is a huge amount of wind turbines there in Texas, which is the darkest color because it has the most megawatts. Now, let me end here on something that I've said a couple times, and that really, when you look at democracy, this is what we need everywhere, not just the Utilities Commission. We need this in all of our agencies. We need this for our children. We need this if we want democracy. We need transparency. We need meaningful process so that all voices are heard. We need inclusiveness so that you've got all viewpoints at the table. We need to count environmental and health damages. That's very, very obvious. And we need to make sure that people matter, not just utility profits. So if there's any comments or questions, I'm happy to stay on. And again, thank you so much for your attention and your time, and for taking the time to participate and to listen to me blather on. So let's see. I'm going to try to see everybody. Yeah, Kelly. Oh, thanks, Kelly. Yeah, if we could just see, I'd love to see everybody. View, gallery. Yeah, anybody have any questions or comments?
I had one, Nancy. Hey, I had mine off, so in case my computer restarted, or Zoom, you know, all the graphics. So I think a lot of people, it kind of goes away and comes back sometimes. And I didn't want to miss anything. I put in there about Leah. Leah Stokes was on a podcast with Chris Hayes, and it was like a year ago. I was listening. I love her too. And she was talking about old power plants and some states that people don't even realize they're totally like losing money and they should totally be shut down, and they're just crap and really old. Probably like the one down the street from me at UNC that Duke sold them. But so do we have any that you know of that are in that category, and are those the ones that they're sticking gas into, or what, you know?
Well, you know what's interesting about that, Maple, and we'll use some of those charts in further sessions. So there was a study done, I think it's about 2 years ago now, time flies, BNEF, Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And basically they did a study and they looked at every coal plant in the country. They reverse engineered data from FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, about how much does each coal plant cost. And they came up with this shocking, it shocked me, that of all the states in the United States, North Carolina has the most uneconomic coal plants, 10,000 megawatts of uneconomic coal plants. And it made such a stink that the NCUC agreed to do some kind of a proceeding on it, but it was right before the pandemic hit. And I'm not exactly sure what happened to it, but we're going to go into that in depth, Maple, because folks like Tyler Norris, you know, Steve Norris's son, he really knows this data and he's really pushed it, and he's just made this very clear. And now that we have these incredible energy analysts and modelers, you know, like Energy Innovation, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, Saul Griffith's group called Electrify America, Leah Stokes. I mean, there's a long list of very, very smart people out there. You're exactly right. And what we're doing is we're running power plants that are costing us way more money. In Arizona, there was a coal plant called Navajo Generating Station. 2,200 megawatts, one of the dirtiest coal plants in the Western United States, over 50 years old. It was costing ratepayers 7 or 8 cents a kilowatt hour to run that power plant. And guess how much solar was? 2.5. 2.5 cents. And yet they ran that power plant for years and years and years. And the regulators just ignored it. So we've got a situation where we have the data. We need the process that allows us to show that data in a meaningful way. Anybody else? Hey, I see Sally. Any comments there, Sally?
Nope, doing a great
Okay.
job. I'm learning something every time.
Oh, good. I hope so. Well, anybody else? Thank you all so much for your time. And
Well, I
you
had
know-
written in there about the fracking getting depleted. I think it was DeGraffia showed up at Duke when we were fighting the gas plant at Duke like 4 years ago. And I think he said is he Colorado? Anyway, I get them mixed up. They're great scientists. And he said it was like depleting like I think it was 2021 was the peak and they were going to run out. And I think it was the Western ones as well, all the shale.
yeah, and we're going to see that. And one of the things I learned, because I did a lot of work on frac reserves and stuff for a long time, what you see is there were early frac sites, Haynesville, what was it called in Texas? It was right near a big city. I can't think of the name of it right now. Anyway, those early fracking sites, they're pretty much played out now. So you see this curve. It's like, yes, you get gas and then it comes faster and faster and then it peaks and then it depletes. I mean, I laugh. I don't expect my refrigerator to just show up with groceries. It's going to run out. I'm going to eat the food and it's going to run out.
Your metaphors are fantastically funny.
Right. That's what we need, right? Good metaphors.
Because then I wrote, well, if we ran out, then they'll want to buy the gas from Russia or the Ukraine. There's a whole bunch of conflict between those two countries, and then China gets it from wherever. It's a freaking mess, and they're building all this stuff. Or then they'll finally do renewables, and then those gas plants will just sit there, and we will still be paying for them.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see what goes on with LNG, because one of the most, if you want to Google something really wild, Google the 10 most expensive energy projects in the world. It was Huffington Post, and this is like a long time ago, maybe even 10 years ago or 8 or something. Anyway, what you see is that the most expensive projects in the world are mostly LNG terminals. And they range from a cheap LNG terminal is $5 billion. If I remember right, the most expensive one was over $100 billion in Australia. And here's what happened in Australia that's wild. Australian people were paying more for Australia-produced natural gas than the people were in Japan, who were buying the Australian gas that got compressed, put on an LNG ship, and shipped to Japan. And it was a scandal. They were like, wait a second, we're shipping our gas to Japan. Why are they paying less? So it's a very, very interesting situation right now in commodities. And that's why I do want to go into it in some depth, because I think we're at a real turning point for commodities. I mean, natural gas, LNG, fossil gas, frack gas, coal, etc. So let's see. Well, thank you all so much. And you got my, you got my email if you want to comment. And
my stomach's kind of churning because I get pissed off, and I already know a lot of this. And then you throw out some even worse numbers. But we need you. But
I know. I'm sorry.
So enraging sometimes.
I'm sorry, people. And you know what's honestly?
Then we need an answer. So you're going to fuel us, and we're getting ready to fight, right?
I know. I'm sorry. I feel the same way sometimes. I get very, very deeply upset. Deeply upset.
And it could be better. People just don't, demand it because they don't think they can, I guess.
Yeah, right. And we have to encourage each other. So.
Yeah, that's why we're doing the series, to educate people.
Oh, yeah.
So promote it to your contacts and friends, and, we'll keep going. We got 4 more sessions.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yep. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, everyone, for joining.
Thank you. All right. Rock on. Keep asking questions.